December 17th, 1944. A frozen clearing east of Bullingen, Belgium. A German Oberleutnant from the 1st SS Panzer Division knelt beside a dead American private and unbuckled his pack. His men had not eaten a hot meal in 2 days. The fuel gauges on his Panthers read nearly empty. He was looking for food and gasoline. He found something else. Inside the American's pack were 3 sealed cardboard boxes, each wrapped in wax coating. He opened the first one. Canned ham and eggs, 4 biscuits, a small bar of chocolate wrapped in foil, a packet of instant coffee, 3 cubes of sugar, a stick of chewing gum, 4 cigarettes, Camels, with a booklet of matches, a tiny bottle of water purification tablets, and at the bottom, folded neatly, a square of toilet paper. He opened the second box. Different meal, processed cheese, lemon drink powder, 5 caramels. Same cigarettes, same matches, same gum, same toilet paper. He opened the third. Beef and pork loaf. Bouillon soup powder. A 2-ounce chocolate bar. Same cigarettes, same sugar, same everything. 3 complete meals. In one private's pack, a man who had been dead in the snow for less than 6 hours and whose pockets still smelled like coffee. The Oberleutnant looked at his sergeant. The sergeant said nothing. He didn't need to. They had seen this before. They had seen it in Normandy, in the foxholes above Omaha Beach. They had seen it in the hedgerows, where abandoned American positions were littered with half-eaten rations and empty cigarette packs. They had seen it in the Hurtgen forest, where every dugout the Americans left behind contained the same wax-coated boxes, the same chocolate, the same 4 cigarettes per meal. And now they were seeing it again in the Ardennes, in every foxhole, on every body, in every supply dump their spearhead overran. It was always the same, not similar, the same. And that was the part that unsettled them. If you're learning something new, a like and a subscribe help these stories reach the people who care about them most. Here is what made this different from the ordinary shock of war. German soldiers understood enemies who had better tanks. They understood enemies who had more planes. They had fought the Soviets, who threw bodies at problems until the problems disappeared. None of that shook them the way this did. What shook them was the packaging. Every American private, not officer, not elite unit, every single rifleman in every single company carried the same 3 meals, the same cigarettes, the same chocolate, the same sulfa tablets, the same bandage, the same razor, the same bar of soap. The contents of one dead American's pack were identical to the contents of every other dead American's pack. Not roughly similar, identical, down to the brand of the cigarettes. A German soldier in December 1944 carried, if he was lucky, a tin of canned meat and a slab of hard rye bread called Kommissbrot. No chocolate, no cigarettes in his ration. Those came separately, 6 per day when supply lines held. No coffee. What he drank was Ersatzkaffee, a bitter brew made from roasted barley and chicory. No toilet paper. No sulfa tablets. No first aid powder. If he was wounded, he waited for a medic who might not come, carrying nothing in his pocket that could stop an infection. And now this German soldier was kneeling in the snow beside an American private, a boy, really, probably 20 years old, from some town he had never heard of. And that boy's pack contained more variety, more calories, more medicine, more comfort than a German platoon sergeant received in a week. That alone would have been demoralizing, but it was not the worst part. The worst part was the realization that came next, the one that crawled into a German soldier's mind and never left. Because if this one American private carried all of this, and the next one carried exactly the same, and the one after that, and the one after that, then somewhere behind these boys, somewhere across an ocean, there was a machine, a system, a country that could produce millions of identical kits, pack them into millions of identical boxes, ship them across 4,000 miles of Atlantic, and deliver them to the individual pocket of every individual soldier in an army of millions. That was the thing they found. Not a weapon, not a tactic, not a secret. A system so vast that it could afford to put 4 cigarettes and a chocolate bar into the pocket of a man it knew might die before lunch. And it did this not once, not as a special allocation, not for a holiday, but every single day, for every single soldier, from North Africa to Normandy to the Ardennes. The Germans had a word for what they felt when they saw it. They didn't write it in their reports, but they said it to each other, quietly, in moments when no officer was listening. And what they said would take the rest of this story to understand. The word they used most often was Wahnsinn, madness. Not the madness of battle, something quieter. The madness of seeing an enemy so rich that he fed his lowest private better than your army fed its officers. But words were one thing. What those German soldiers did next told a deeper story. On that same morning, December 17th, Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's armored column was racing west through the Ardennes. His mission was speed. Capture bridges over the Meuse River before the Americans could regroup. Every hour mattered. Every minute mattered. Hitler's entire offensive depended on Peiper reaching Antwerp before the Allies understood what was happening. And Peiper was already behind schedule. His Panthers and Tigers had burned through fuel faster than anyone had planned. A Panther drank 270 liters of gasoline for every 100 kilometers. A King Tiger drank 450. German planners had calculated enough fuel for 48 hours. After that, the plan was simple. Capture American fuel and keep moving. So when Peiper's scouts reported an American fuel depot at Bullingen, 50,000 gallons of gasoline sitting in drums on a small airfield, he swung 2 miles off his assigned route to take it. His tanks roared in with headlights blazing through the snow. They captured the depot. They captured 50 American soldiers. They forced those Americans at gunpoint to refuel their panzers. Peiper got his fuel, but he lost something he could not get back: time. Because while his tanks were being refueled, his infantry found the American camp. And they stopped. They stopped and opened every box, every crate, every pack they could find. They ate chocolate they had not tasted in months. They smoked American cigarettes, real tobacco, not the sawdust and cabbage blend that German factories had been producing since 1943. They stuffed their pockets with sugar cubes and chewing gum and instant coffee. Hold that detail. German soldiers stuffing their pockets with American coffee. Because it is going to matter enormously before this story is over. Peiper raged. He needed his column moving. But the same scene repeated itself at every captured American position his spearhead overran. At Hunsfeld, German soldiers ransacked an American motor pool and took so long sorting through equipment that the column lost another hour. At Ligneuville, they found an American officer's mess with hot food still on the stove. Men who had been living on hard bread and canned meat for weeks sat down and ate steak. This was not indiscipline. These were veteran SS soldiers, some of the most hardened troops in the Wehrmacht. They did not stop because they were weak. They stopped because they were starving. And the gap between what they carried and what every American carried was so enormous that encountering it broke something inside them. Some quiet agreement that the war could still be won. Now pay attention to this because it reveals the deeper pattern. The German army in December 1944 was not starving because Germany had no food. Germany still had warehouses of canned beef and pork. The problem was not production. The problem was transportation. Allied bombing had shattered the rail network. Roads were cratered. Bridges were gone. The food existed. It just could not reach the men who needed it. The American army had the opposite problem, which is to say, it had no problem at all. The K-ration, that wax-coated box the Oberleutnant had opened in the snow, was designed to travel. It weighed 36 ounces. It fit in a cargo pocket. It needed no refrigeration, no cooking, no field kitchen, No supply chain beyond a truck and a quartermaster sergeant who could count. One crate held 12 rations, 36 meals, and could be dropped from an airplane, thrown from a moving vehicle, buried in a foxhole, or carried on a man's back for a week. The German equivalent, the Eiserne Portion, the iron ration, was a tin of meat and a packet of hard crackers. No variety, no vitamins, no comfort. And it required an officer's explicit permission to open because the German army could not replace it fast enough to let soldiers eat it freely. Think about what that means. The American private could eat whenever he wanted. The German private needed his commander's authorization to open his own food. Two armies, same war, same weather, same forest. One carried 3 hot meals and chocolate in its pockets. The other carried permission slips. But the K-ration was only the surface. It was only what a German soldier noticed first, because hunger was the loudest voice in his body. Once he had eaten, once that first wave of shock passed, he started looking more carefully at what else the dead American carried. And what he found in the American's breast pocket was, in its own way, more disturbing than the food. It was a small canvas pouch, olive drab, stamped with a red cross. And inside it was something that German soldiers on the Western Front had been begging their own army for since Normandy. Sulfa. 8 white tablets in a wax paper envelope, tucked inside a canvas pouch no bigger than a man's palm. Next to them, a shaker bottle of sulfanilamide powder, fine, yellow, meant to be poured directly into an open wound. And beside that, a sterile bandage already coated with the same powder, sealed in cellophane, ready to press against a bullet hole the instant it happened. Every American soldier carried this. Every one. A German infantryman in December 1944 carried a bandage. That was it. A strip of cotton cloth. No powder, no tablets, no antiseptic of any kind. If a bullet went through his shoulder, and bullets went through a lot of shoulders in the Ardennes, the cloth he pressed against the wound had been in his pocket for days, against dirty wool, against skin that hadn't been washed in a week. The bacteria on that cloth would be inside his body within hours. The sulfa tablets changed that equation entirely, and German soldiers knew it. They had learned it the hard way, not from training manuals, but from watching what happened to their own wounded versus what happened to American wounded. A German private hit in the leg and treated with a dirty bandage had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of developing a wound infection that could kill him. An American private hit in the same leg who poured sulfa powder into the wound and swallowed 2 tablets with water from his canteen had dramatically better odds. Not because he was tougher, because he had 8 tablets in his pocket, and the German had none. There was a soldier named Robinson, a private during the Ardennes fighting, who understood this equation with perfect clarity. When his unit was overrun and he knew capture was minutes away, he did not try to hide his rifle. He did not try to destroy his maps. He reached into his first aid pouch, pulled out all 8 sulfa tablets, and swallowed them at once. He had no water. He chewed them dry and washed them down with handfuls of snow. Years later, he explained why. His words were simple, and they require no decoration. He said, "I knew the Germans would take them from me first thing." Remember that sentence. A wounded American soldier, bleeding in the snow, his unit destroyed, facing capture. And his first thought is not about his weapon, not about escape, not about the enemy approaching through the trees. His first thought is, they are going to take my medicine. Because he knew, from months of fighting, that sulfa was the first thing German soldiers removed from American prisoners and American dead. Before watches, before cigarettes, before chocolate. Sulfa first. Always sulfa first. Now here is the detail that makes this story something more than a tale of supply shortages. Here is where the pattern deepens from troubling into something that German officers found genuinely difficult to think about. Sulfanilamide was not an American invention. It was German. A German chemist named Gerhard Domach, working at the Bayer Laboratories, had discovered it in 1935. It was a German breakthrough. German science. German genius. The discovery had won Domach the Nobel Prize, which the Nazi government forced him to decline. But that is a different story for a different day. Germany had invented the drug that stopped wound infections. And by December 1944, Germany could not put it into the pockets of its own soldiers. America could. America had taken a German discovery, industrialized it, manufactured it by the ton, packaged it into individual doses, sealed those doses in wax paper, placed them into millions of identical canvas pouches, and delivered them to the individual breast pocket of every private in an army fighting 4,000 miles from home. The country that invented sulfa couldn't give it to its riflemen. The country that borrowed sulfa gave 8 tablets to each of its 8 million soldiers, and still had enough left over to supply the British. That is not a medical story. That is an industrial story. And it is the same story as the K-ration, and the same story as the cigarettes, and it is building towards something that the German soldiers did not have a name for yet, but could feel forming in their minds like a shape in fog. Because once a German soldier had noticed the food, and then noticed the medicine, he began to notice everything. He began to look at the Americans' boots, and they were new, with rubber soles, and they were the same boots on every American foot. He looked at the American's helmet, pressed steel, lined with webbing, identical to every other helmet in the division. He looked at the American's rifle, and that is where the next part of this story begins. Because the rifle told a story that the food and the sulfa only hinted at. The food said, "This army is rich." The sulfa said, "This army cares whether its men survive." But the rifle said something else entirely. Something about the way Americans fought that German soldiers had never encountered in 5 years of war. And it started with a sound. A German veteran of the Eastern Front could tell you what a Soviet attack sounded like. It sounded like a wave. Thousands of bolt-action Mosin Nagants cracking in ragged sequence, punctuated by the fast ripping of submachine guns carried by squad leaders. There was a rhythm to it. The rifles were slow, the submachine guns were fast, and you could hear the difference. You knew where the leaders were. You knew where the conscripts were. The sound told you the shape of the attack. A German veteran of the Western Front in 1944 heard something different from the Americans. Something wrong. There was no slow. There was no fast. There was only one sound. A rapid, steady, percussive hammering, 8 rounds in roughly 3 seconds, from every position, at every range, from every American soldier in the line. Not just the squad leaders, not just the specialists, everyone. And then a sharp metallic ping, the empty clip ejecting, and the hammering started again. That sound was the M1 Garand. And the reason it unnerved German soldiers was not what the rifle could do, it was who carried it. In the German army, equipment depended on who you were. A Fallschirmjäger, a paratrooper, carried different weapons than a Volksgrenadier. An SS Panzergrenadier carried different gear than a regular Wehrmacht rifleman. A veteran division that had been refitted in France carried better equipment than a replacement division scraped together from 16-year-olds and men with stomach ailments. The quality of a German soldier's kit told you his story, how long he had served, which unit he belonged to, whether his army still considered him worth supplying. The American army had no such variation. When a German soldier picked up a dead American's M1 Garand in the Hurtgen forest in November, it was the same rifle as the one he had picked up from a dead American at Saint-Lô in July. Same manufacturer's stamp, same 8-round clip, same semi-automatic action. Same walnut stock. The private from the 99th Infantry Division, a green unit that had never heard a shot fired, carried exactly the same weapon as the private from the 1st Infantry Division, who had been fighting since North Africa. Put yourself in a German platoon sergeant's boots for a moment. You have been fighting for 3 years. Your squad carries 5 different types of weapons: bolt-action Kar 98s for most of your riflemen, an MG42 for your machine gun team, MP40s for a couple of men if you are lucky, perhaps a STG-44 if your division has been prioritized for the new assault rifle, which it probably has not. Your ammunition is not interchangeable between these weapons. Your men are not interchangeable between these roles. If your machine gunner is killed, you cannot simply hand his gun to a rifleman, because the rifleman has not been trained on it and does not carry its ammunition. Now look across the field at the Americans. Every man carries the same rifle. Every man fires the same ammunition. Every man can pick up the weapon of the man beside him and keep fighting without hesitation. If a squad loses its leader, the next man steps forward, picks up the same rifle he already carries, and nothing changes. The squad does not slow down. It does not reorganize. It does not wait for a specialist. It keeps firing at the same rate, the same 8 rounds per clip, the same metallic ping, the same relentless hammering. The American Rifle Squad was not a collection of specialists. It was a system of identical parts. And here is where a German soldier, if he was paying attention, and by 1944, the ones still alive were all paying attention, would feel the shape in the fog becoming clearer. Because the rifle was saying the same thing the K-ration had said, and the sulfa tablets had said, and the boots and the helmets and the cigarettes had said. It was all the same message, delivered over and over in different voices. This army was not built around individuals. It was built around a principle. The principle that no single man was irreplaceable, because every single man was equipped identically to every other man, trained on the same weapons as every other man, fed the same food as every other man, and treated with the same medicine as every other man. The system did not depend on heroes. It did not depend on elite units. It did not depend on veterans. It depended on the fact that a 19-year-old replacement from Ohio, arriving at the front on a Tuesday, could step into a foxhole vacated by a dead man from Pennsylvania on Monday and fight at the same level. Because he carried the same rifle, the same rations, the same sulfa, the same everything. The German army produced extraordinary soldiers. It produced men who could do things with a bolt-action rifle and an MG42 that no other army soldiers could do. But it could not replace those men when they died, and it could not equip their replacements to the same standard. The American army did not need extraordinary soldiers. It needed enough ordinary ones. And it equipped every single one of them as if he were the last man standing. That is what a German soldier was beginning to understand in the winter of 1944, standing in a captured American foxhole, holding a dead man's rifle that was identical to every other rifle in an army of 4 million. But he had not yet seen the thing that would turn understanding into certainty. He had not yet looked at what the Americans threw away. It was the garbage. In 5 years of war, across every front, the German army had learned to read enemy positions by what they left behind. Soviet positions told stories of scarcity, empty tin cans scraped clean, cartridge cases collected for reuse, rags that had served as bandages rewound and reused until they were black with old blood. British positions were tidier but lean. Tea tins, empty Enfield clips, the occasional discarded sock. You could read an army's health by its waist, the way a doctor reads a patient's face. American positions read like nothing the Germans had ever seen. They found unopened rations, not empty boxes, full ones. Entire cases of K-rations, still sealed, left in foxholes when units moved forward. They found half-eaten chocolate bars tossed into the mud, packs of cigarettes with 1 or 2 missing, the rest abandoned, full canteens of water, rolls of bandages, unused, still in cellophane, ponchos, shelter halves, wool blankets, items that a German soldier would have carried until they rotted off his body, lying in piles at the edges of abandoned camps like things that no longer mattered. In the Hurtgen Forest, where American and German units fought over the same ground for 3 months, positions changed hands so many times that German soldiers became connoisseurs of American waste. And what they noticed, what ate at them, was not just the volume, it was the casualness. The Americans did not leave these things behind in panic. They were not retreating in disorder. Their positions were often orderly, their foxholes well dug, their fields of fire carefully chosen. They simply moved on and left behind what they did not need, because they knew more was coming. A German company commander in the Hurtgen, if he captured an American position, would immediately order his men to collect every usable item, every ration, every bandage, every clip of ammunition. This was standard operating procedure in the Wehrmacht by late 1944, not because officers were disciplined, but because the army could not replace what was consumed. When a German soldier fired his weapon, the brass casings were collected. When a German soldier's boots wore through, he patched them with whatever material was available: leather from a dead man's belt, rubber from a tire, cardboard from a ration box. Nothing was discarded. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was surplus. The American army did not collect brass casings. It did not patch boots. It sent new ones. Now hold 2 images in your mind at the same time. In one image, a German supply sergeant is carefully counting his platoon's remaining rations. 14 tins of canned meat for 32 men, enough for 2 days if each man eats half a tin per day. In the other image, an American quartermaster sergeant is pushing cases of K rations off the back of a 2.5-ton truck and not counting them at all, because another truck is right behind this one and another behind that one. And somewhere, in a depot outside Liège, there are 400,000 more cases. And somewhere on the Atlantic, there is a Liberty ship carrying 250,000 more. And somewhere in a factory in Chicago, a production line is sealing 60,000 rations per hour and has not stopped since 1942. That is not abundance. That is a different kind of war. And by December 1944, some German officers were beginning to understand this clearly enough to put it into words. Not in official reports. Official reports still spoke of holding the line, of counterattack, of final victory. The words came out in private, in letters that were never sent, in conversations between officers who trusted each other enough to say what they saw. The conversations that survive come from an extraordinary source. In 2001, a German historian named Sönke Neitzel discovered 150,000 pages of transcripts in the British and American National Archives. They were recordings, covert recordings, of German prisoners of war talking to each other in captivity. The British and Americans had bugged the barracks, the mess halls, the exercise yards, even the trees. The prisoners did not know they were being listened to. They spoke freely. And what they said about American material abundance was consistent across every branch of service, every rank, every theater of war. They did not talk about American courage. They did not talk about American tactics. They talked about American things. The unending, incomprehensible, maddening river of things. The trucks and the tires and the fuel and the food and the boots and the razors and the toilet paper and the coffee, real coffee, in individual packets in every single soldier's pocket, while they drank roasted barley and called it Ersatzkaffee and pretended it was acceptable. Remember that detail from Büdingen? German soldiers stuffing their pockets with American coffee? Here is why it matters. Coffee was not a luxury in a soldier's life. It was the line between functioning and collapsing. A man who has been awake for 36 hours in freezing weather, who has been shelled and shot at and has watched the man next to him die, that man needs coffee the way he needs ammunition. And the American army understood this so completely that it put instant coffee into every breakfast ration of every soldier in the entire army, from private to general, from North Africa to the Philippines. The German army gave its men roasted grain and told them it was fine. In those bugged conversations, the prisoners kept circling back to the same question, phrasing it differently each time, but always arriving at the same place. The question was not how to beat the Americans. The question was whether the Americans could be beaten at all. By anyone. Ever. When the country behind them could do this. And the answer they were arriving at, alone in their cells, talking to men they thought no one could hear, was the answer that had been forming since the first German soldier opened the first American pack and found chocolate, cigarettes, and sulfa inside. But the full weight of that answer required one more thing. One more discovery. Not on the battlefield, but in a place where no fighting happened at all. A place where captured German soldiers saw something that silenced them completely. The place was a transit camp. An American transit camp. Not for prisoners yet, but for the German soldiers who had just been pulled off the line, hands up, stumbling through snow into captivity. The first thing that happened to a newly captured German soldier on the Western Front was processing. He was searched, his weapons and documents taken, his name and rank recorded. This was expected. This was the Geneva Convention at work, and most German soldiers, by late 1944, had already imagined what it would feel like. What they had not imagined was the meal. At American processing points, captured German soldiers were given food. Not scraps, not the cold dregs of whatever was left over. They were given the same K rations that American soldiers ate. The same wax-coated boxes, the same canned meat, the same chocolate, the same instant coffee, the same 4 cigarettes. The same meal that the guards standing over them were eating. For many German prisoners, this was the moment the war ended. Not the surrender, not the hands in the air, not the walk through the snow. The war ended when an American private, no older than 20, tossed a K ration at a man who had been trying to kill him 6 hours earlier, and said nothing, and walked away, as if feeding the enemy was so routine it did not require comment. One German officer described it later in a conversation he did not know was being recorded. He said he looked at the K ration in his hand, and then looked at the American guard eating the identical ration 3 meters away. And he understood, in that moment, that the Americans were not giving prisoners something special. They were giving prisoners the ordinary. They were sharing what they had because what they had was so vast that sharing it cost them nothing. That realization, the realization of the ordinary, was more devastating than any battle. Because a German officer could rationalize losing a tank engagement, he could explain it with terrain, with air superiority, with numerical disadvantage. He could tell himself that German tanks were better, that German crews were better trained, that the outcome would have been different under different conditions. These were the stories that kept men fighting. But he could not rationalize a country that fed its prisoners the same food it fed its own soldiers. He could not explain a system that treated an enemy's hunger with the same casual efficiency it treated its own. That was not a tactical advantage. That was not something you could counter with a better panzer division or a more aggressive Kampfgruppe. That was a civilization operating at a level of production so far beyond Germany's capacity that the comparison was no longer military, it was mathematical. And here is where the real weight of this story arrives. Here is where the individual details, the chocolate, the sulfa, the rifles, the garbage, converge into the single truth that German soldiers could feel but struggled to articulate. The American system was not designed to win battles. It was designed to win the war. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a sword and a factory. A sword can be sharper. A sword can be wielded by a master. A sword can win any individual contest. But a factory makes 10,000 swords a day, and it does not care whether the man holding each one is a master or a novice, because the sword is designed to work in any hand. And when the master, with his single perfect blade, faces an army of 10,000 men with identical, adequate blades, the master dies. Not because he is worse, because he is one. German soldiers understood this metaphor in their bones by late 1944, even if they never phrased it that way. They understood it every time they captured an American position and found the same boots, the same rifle, the same rations, the same medicine, the same cigarettes. as if the Americans were not individual men at all, but products of a system that stamped them out like engine parts. Interchangeable, replaceable, infinite. And that word, replaceable, was the word that cut deepest. Because German soldiers were not replaceable. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht was filling its ranks with boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm. 16-year-olds who had never held a rifle stood next to 50-year-old shopkeepers who had last fired a weapon in 1918. They wore mismatched uniforms. They carried whatever weapon was available. A Czech rifle here, a captured French carbine there, sometimes a Panzerfaust, and nothing else. They were not interchangeable. They were not standardized. They were the opposite. A patchwork, an improvisation, a desperate last gesture by a system that had run out of parts. Across the line, every new American replacement who stepped off a truck at a depot in Belgium carried the same M1 Garand, wore the same boots, ate the same K ration, and carried the same 8 sulfa tablets in his breast pocket as the man he was replacing. He might have been drafted 4 months ago. He might have been a shoe salesman from Missouri. It did not matter. The system had made him identical to every other soldier, and he would function at the same level, because the system was not built on talent. It was built on adequacy multiplied by infinity. The Germans built the best soldiers in the world. The Americans built enough soldiers for the world. And every captured foxhole proved it. But there is still one piece of this story missing. One thing the Germans found that we have not yet discussed, something quieter than food or medicine or rifles, something so small that most accounts of the war do not mention it at all. And yet, when German intelligence officers analyzed captured American positions in their reports, this one detail kept appearing, circled, underlined, flagged as significant. It was a piece of paper, not a map, not an order, not anything official. A letter. A letter from home. German intelligence officers cataloging the contents of captured American positions kept finding them. In breast pockets, in helmet liners, tucked into the pages of pocket Bibles, folded inside K-ration boxes where soldiers kept them dry. Personal letters from the United States, written on clean white stationery, in ballpoint ink, delivered by a postal system so precise that a woman in Dayton, Ohio, could mail a letter on a Monday, and her son would read it in a foxhole in Belgium 9 days later. The letters were not classified. They contained no military secrets. German intelligence officers read them anyway, because captured mail was a window into enemy morale, and enemy morale was one of the few advantages Germany still believed it might exploit. What they found instead broke that belief apart. The letters did not describe a nation at war. They described a nation at peace. A mother wrote about the new curtains in the kitchen. A father mentioned the price of a used Ford at the dealership on Vine Street. A wife described Thanksgiving dinner, turkey, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and complained that the grocery had been out of whipping cream. A girl wrote about a dance at the high school gymnasium and asked her brother if he thought he would be home by spring. Curtains, car prices, pumpkin pie, a high school dance. A German soldier in December 1944 could not receive a letter from home because the postal system between the front and Germany had been shattered by Allied bombing. But even if a letter had arrived, what would it have described? His mother's apartment in Cologne had been flattened by a 1,000-bomber raid in June. His father was working double shifts at a munitions factory that had been relocated underground to escape the bombing. His sister was eating turnip soup for the 3rd week in a row because there was no bread in the shops. Nobody was complaining about whipping cream. Nobody was buying a Ford. And yet here, in his hand, was proof that the country fighting him, the country whose soldiers he was killing and who were killing his friends, was so untouched by this war that its civilians worried about dessert toppings and school dances. Now put those letters next to everything else a German soldier had already seen. The K ration with 4 cigarettes per meal. The sulfa tablets in every breast pocket. The identical rifles, the new boots, the thrown-away blankets, the half-eaten chocolate in the mud. And now this, proof that the home behind the army was not suffering at all. Each item alone was a data point. Together, they formed a verdict. The verdict was not that America had more tanks or more planes, though it had both. It was not that American soldiers were braver or better trained, because German soldiers knew they were not. The verdict was something worse, something that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. The verdict was that Germany was fighting a country that was waging total war with one hand and living a normal life with the other. A country so deep in resources, so vast in capacity, so far from the fighting that it could produce an army of millions, equip each man identically, ship him across an ocean, feed him 3 meals a day with chocolate and coffee, give him medicine that Germany had invented but could no longer manufacture, arm him with a semi-automatic rifle that even a 4-month conscript could operate. And do all of this without asking its civilians to give up pie. That was the unsettling thing. Not one item, not the food or the medicine or the rifle or the garbage or the letters. The pattern. The relentless, mechanical, identical, inexhaustible pattern, visible in every captured position, on every dead body, in every abandoned foxhole from Normandy to the Ardennes. A pattern that said, there is no bottom to this. There is no shortage coming. There is no moment when this army runs out. Because the machine behind it does not stop, and the country behind the machine does not suffer. And the ocean between them is full of ships, and the ships are full of everything, and there will always be more. A German soldier could kill 10 Americans in a day and feel nothing change. The 11th would arrive tomorrow, carrying the same pack, the same rifle, the same chocolate, the same sulfa, the same letter from a mother who was worried about curtains. In the bugged prisoner of war conversations discovered by Sönke Neitzel, one captured German officer returned to this idea again and again, trying to explain it to a fellow prisoner who had served on the Eastern Front and did not yet understand the Western Front. The Eastern Front officer kept asking about tactics, about terrain, about armored formations. And the Western Front officer kept saying, quietly, that none of that mattered. What mattered, he said, was that the Americans could lose everything and replace it overnight. You destroy a division, they bring another division. You destroy their supplies, they bring more supplies. You capture their positions, and the positions are so full of material that your own men stop fighting to loot them. And by the time they start again, the Americans have built new positions with new material that arrived on new trucks, driven by new soldiers eating new rations. It is not an army, he said. It is a river. And you cannot stop a river by killing the water. He was right. And the proof had been there all along. In every wax-coated box, in every shaker of sulfa powder, in every letter about pumpkin pie, waiting for someone to read it. But the full cost of that proof, the human weight of it, belongs to one man. And to understand it, we need to go back to where this story began, to the frozen clearing east of Bullingen on the morning of December 17th, and follow the man who knelt beside a dead American private and opened his pack. We do not know his name. The German records from Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance through the Ardennes are fragmentary. Unit rosters were destroyed, war diaries were burned in the final weeks of the war, and the officers who survived the fighting faced trial at Dachau in 1946 and had reasons of their own to leave certain details unrecorded. But we know what happened to his column. After Bullingen, Peiper's spearhead pushed west. It captured more fuel. It captured more American positions. And at every one, the same scene repeated. German soldiers stopping to eat American food, to smoke American cigarettes, to stuff American coffee into their pockets. Every stop cost time. Every hour of lost time allowed the Americans to blow another bridge, to move another division into the gap, to tighten the noose that Piper did not yet feel closing around him. By December 19th, 3 days after the offensive began, the column had reached the town of L'Église, 11 miles short of the Meuse. And there it stopped. Not because of American resistance, though the resistance was fierce. Not because of the terrain, though the roads were narrow and icy. It stopped because the Panthers and Tigers had drunk their last drop of fuel, and no more was coming. The German supply network that could not deliver sulfa to its riflemen could not deliver gasoline to its tanks. For 5 days, Piper's men held L'Église. They fought off American attacks from 3 directions. They waited for fuel that had been promised and never arrived. And on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, Piper made the decision that ended his part of the war. He ordered his men to abandon their vehicles, all of them, every tank, every half-track, every armored car. They drained the last fuel from the vehicles into lighters and stoves. They spiked the guns. And then 800 men, what remained of a force that had numbered 5,000 8 days earlier, walked east through the forest, in the snow, in the dark, carrying nothing but their rifles and whatever they had in their pockets. Some of them still had American chocolate. Some still had American cigarettes. A few still had packets of American instant coffee, which they had been hoarding for days, brewing tiny cups over matches cupped in frozen hands. They walked back through the same territory they had driven through a week before in tanks. They passed the same American positions they had overrun, now reoccupied by fresh American units. Units that had arrived from reserve, fully equipped, fully fed, carrying the same K rations and the same sulfa and the same M1 Garens as the men they replaced. As if nothing had happened. As if the German offensive had been absorbed the way a river absorbs a stone. A momentary ripple, then the current resumes. 800 men walking through snow on Christmas Eve, past an army that had already replaced everything they had destroyed. The Ardennes offensive gained 50 miles in its first week. By the end of January, every mile had been taken back. The final cost to Germany was 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. Losses the Wehrmacht could never replace. The cost to the Americans was 80,000 casualties, 700 tanks, and a number of supply depots that were restocked within days. The Germans spent their last reserves. The Americans restocked from a pipeline that never closed. And the soldiers who walked back from L'Église on Christmas Eve knew this. They had known it since Bühlingen. They had known it since the first time they opened an American pack and found chocolate and sulfa and coffee and cigarettes inside, packaged with the calm efficiency of a country that could afford to be thorough about even the smallest things. The toilet paper, the chewing gum, the 4 matches and a tiny booklet, the key for opening the tin of ham. They had known it, and they had kept fighting anyway. Because that is what soldiers do. They fight even after they understand, especially after they understand. Decades later, historians studying the bugged transcripts from the prisoner of war camps, those 150,000 pages of private conversations, noticed a pattern. German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front talked about the Russians with hatred, with contempt, sometimes with grudging respect for their endurance. German soldiers captured on the Western Front talked about the Americans with something else entirely. It was not hatred. It was not contempt. It was not even respect, exactly. It was silence. Long pauses in conversations where a question had been asked and no answer was offered. Moments where a soldier who had just described the contents of an American foxhole simply stopped talking, as if the description itself was the conclusion, and nothing more needed to be said. That silence was the sound of men who had opened the same wax-coated boxes and found the same 4 cigarettes, and understood what they meant. Every army tells its soldiers a story about why they will win. The story might be about racial superiority, It might be about divine providence. It might be about the strength of the fatherland, or the genius of the Führer, or the invincibility of German steel. These stories keep men fighting in the dark, in the cold, when the rational thing to do is stop. The Americans told no such story. They did not need to. They simply opened a box and showed you 3 meals, a chocolate bar, a packet of coffee, 4 cigarettes, and 8 sulfa tablets. And they let you do the math. That was what the Germans found. Every time. In every foxhole, on every body, in every position from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. Not a weapon, not a secret. A quiet, wax-coated, mass-produced truth. That the war had been decided not by who fought harder, but by who could put a chocolate bar into the pocket of every soldier in an army of millions and never run out. Thank you for watching this. I mean it. If this story gave you something, a detail you did not know, a perspective you had not considered, then a like truly helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these stories find the people who want to hear them. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be grateful if you hit that button and the bell beside it so you do not miss what comes next. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, your father, your grandfather, your grandmother, tell me about them. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Every single one.